Hi everyone, Tim from Chamferzone here. Welcome back to the final chapter of our Revolver tutorial. As already previously announced, this is a free to watch for everyone part, and that means that even if you haven't followed the Revolver all the way, you can still get something out of it, because whether we put the Revolver in here or anything else of a similar size, the fundamentals are going to be the same. For anyone that did come all the way to this point, congratulations. It's been quite the journey, all the way from basic reference image setup over to modeling, unwrapping, baking, as well as texturing. And now it's time to make it all look nice and shiny as we create beautiful renders, a turntable animation, as well as having a look at how to assemble a scene in Blender, and then simply bringing it back here to Marmoset for a scene composition render. On top of that, we also have a look at basic animations in Marmoset. So for example, if you want to have the cylinder of the Revolver spinning 360 at the same time where we have a turntable animation, we can then simply do that in the timeline together with a few keyframes. So there's quite a bit of content here in the following hour. I hope you're going to enjoy it. I'll see you next time. Happy rendering and cheers! Welcome back to the final chapter of our Revolver tutorial. This one is not gonna take as long as the other chapters, but nevertheless it's one of the most important parts because it's all about presenting our artwork. So what we want to do is navigate over to our engine folder. This is the version of the gun that we set up for in-game use and also for renders. And now let's just drag that in here. Drag and drop works perfectly fine here for Marmoset. And you can see now we have it already nicely separated here. Our flashlight, and then our red dot scope that consists out of these pieces, and everything else is also how we were setting it up in Blender. So now what we have to do is assign the textures to these materials here, which are also the ones that we already assigned in Blender. If you press Shift, you can change the lighting source, similar to how it is in Substance Painter. But for now, what we want to start with is by assigning our textures into these slots here. So I'm gonna go over to the folder where we exported it to. And then, by the way, you can ignore these normal maps that look like that here. We only want the ones that are completed. And those are the ones where it says OpenGL at the end. So I'm gonna start here with our Revolver with the normal map, and then let's carry on with the albedo, which is our base color. Gonna continue with our roughness map, and then our metalness map. And then if we want, we can also add the occlusion to it. It's not necessary. And we can also dial it down if it's too strong, but let's just plug it also in here. So that way we have our Revolver. Next, let's do our scope. And same as before, let's start from the top. Red dot scope, wait, where do we have it? Here. Red dot scope, and then our albedo is the base color, and then red dot scope roughness, and then our metalness map is this one, and then we can also add our occlusion. So these steps are always the same, even if you do that in a game engine environment. You just got to make sure you're plugging in the right textures and you don't want to have any error. We're gonna make the lens and that red dot in a moment, but let's carry on here also with our flashlight. Normal map, and then our base color, and then we have our roughness map as well as the metalness map. And then we can also add our AO map. The AO map is really just giving a little bit of extra shadow. It's actually not required in a PBR environment, but we can always change it with the sliders if it's too strong or not. Sometimes it just adds a little bit of extra depth. So also what we want to add is the emissive map here for our flashlight. Right now this is what it would look like without any emissive information. But then what we can do is go over here to emission, and we have to enable it. We have to decide which one we want, and we want the emissive. Now what we can do is add this texture, and that way we can basically turn on and off our flashlight. So I'm just gonna leave it turned off for now. There might be like a one or the other render where you want to have it on. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to save my scene. I already have a save here, so I'm just going to overwrite it. But just so that we already have this in place. So now we have the main components, but then let's carry on here with our lens. And it's a bit hard to read. Actually, I have to try out if this is the right slot for it. I'm gonna go over, and you know what? We don't even really need to have a normal map for it because there's no information on it. But since we exported it, let's just apply it anyway. So where is the lens? Is over here. And yeah, I already see it's the right one. Red dot scope, lens, base color. Remember, we put it to a gray because now we have the control over what kind of a color we want to have on it. But we can do that later. So I'm gonna put also our roughness map. Red dots. Oh, that was the wrong one. That was the dot. Red dot scope, lens. Here it is. Now it's nice and glossy. And then what else can we put to that? Actually, those are already enough. What we then can do is go over here to the transparency, and if we put that to dither, we have control over our alpha strength here. So for now, I'm just gonna put it to half, 0.5, and then we can always see later if we like it or not. So let's also do this dot here. This would be that one. And let's go over to our albedo. And this one, I'm gonna add the base color. And then what we want to do is go over to our transparency and also put that to dither. And then we can add, it's the same as the base color, so it actually doesn't matter, but we're just gonna add this. And now we just have to put it to any of these channels. So if you put it to R, we have it cut out like that. And now in order to get some color on there, we can change our albedo color, but we can also add emissiveness to it. And for that, we don't even need a texture. So we have the color control slot, and then we want to put the intensity up. But then we also want to put the glow up. So right now it's black, which means we don't see anything. But now if we put that here also to a red, you see that we actually get the emissive information on it. So now we got some color on it, but we're gonna make that all look much nicer once we get to the renders. Right now we're still working on the setting up the materials. And speaking of which, let's duplicate this Revolver material and let's call this one here Revolver and the other Revolver Metal. And now we can go over here to this one, and then we just want to switch out the textures. So let's do that. Here's the roughness map, here's the metallic. We don't see any of it right now because we haven't assigned it yet. But now what we can do with this is drag that over here to the Revolver body. And now you can see we have the metallic version on it. So we might do some renders with that once we have the actual setup in place, but I want to mainly stick here to the main material for it. So now we have our textures in place. Let's make this all look more interesting. So there will always be people who use Marmoset for the first time that follow the tutorial. And let's just take a look here at some of the basic things, such as, for example, here our main camera, which we are currently looking through. Imagine whatever we control here is what we are seeing here in our viewport. And you can see that very good by changing the field of view, which by default is set to a 45. So that means we have a bit of perspective here on our gun. And if this is how you like it, then by all means keep it that way. But what I always like to do is to put that down quite a bit. In fact, I'm gonna have it around here. And what that means is that if we zoom out now, we have almost an orthographic view, as you can see. So there's not much of a perspective on it anymore. And I just find that this suits the look for the renders in the best way. This is just how I always like to do it. And I guess it's also because I'm used to working in the orthographic viewport. So maybe this is just my personal preference, but I just can't stand it if my renders are looking like this, you know? I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I want to have everything sort of like captured in an equal kind of a distance or perspective, and that's why I like to put my field of view here around 5. So that would be the first thing. And there is more that we can do here in these camera settings. But it's always a bit of like a construction site where we don't want to change all the camera settings before our actual scene also looks good. The camera settings are sort of complementing then our scene setup. So now let's take a look at our sky. So just a quick mention of how that actually works here in Marmoset with our lights that we currently have here, and that you can see even here as a reflection in our lens. So the way that this works is that here under our sky tab, we then have different HDRI images that we can select, and they already contain light information. So we are actually looking at our Revolver here in the environment of this parking garage HDRI image. So that already gives us a bit of extra control here. Without even adding further lights, we can basically already get a nice picture here. And if we want, we can further increase the light here. And then it says here child light brightness. This slider right now, it won't do anything. And that's because we haven't added any additional lights. So let me just put that all back here to the default values. But think of it like that. If you want to add maybe a light somewhere here in that scene, then we click in it, right now we're not seeing anything because we have to then let go. So now we let go, we have this light in here, and you can see it starts illuminating the revolver now from this angle. So we can even slide that around here, and that way we get it coming from different angles. So think of this HDR image like something that wraps around here in our scene and illuminates the revolver from all sides, and we just gonna add more lights to it to make it better. So this one here, I placed it right where we already have the intense light, and that also makes it then very intense here on the appearance. If we put that more like where we have a really dark tone, it won't do as much. But sometimes it might be not the worst idea to put it, for example, here where we have some red. And now if we increase the child brightness, you see it's picking up here from this red information. So think of it like that in a way where we can enhance the actual image that we already have here in the scene by basically dragging some extra lights on it. If we put it here to where we have the yellow, then you can see we get a bit more of a yellow tint. But then we are also able to go into these lights and further change our light. So for example, if we want that to be like a really intense yellow, then now you can see this is also what we get here. Just keep in mind that if you added like a custom color and then you move it around here again, it will pick up the color from wherever you place it. So in that sense, it's basically like a reset. So then we can now control here our child light brightness, and essentially the way that we make a nice render is by choosing the HDRI image that we like and adding proper lights to it. Right now we have it set to ambient sky here, our backdrop. If we put that here to sky, then you actually see the image in the background, and that makes it also maybe a bit more clear if we change the direction here. So if we press shift and move it, then we get light coming here depending on that image. And this is basically another way that we want to control the overall look. So often what I usually do is I put a new skylight in, and then I change our camera here. Well, I should say the skylight direction till I have it somewhere where it looks interesting, and then I start fine-tuning it. So usually that sky backdrop is not really the one that I want to have. So you can also put it to blurred sky. That way you still see a little bit more of the background, and you can also have more or less blur here through that control. So I'm actually quite liking the idea to have a bit of color in the background, but in most cases I like to have a dark background. And I find that the mode that I use the most is the ambient sky. That sort of like averages all the colors into mostly gradients between black and whites with a little bit of color. And I find that this usually works the best for what I want to do. And most of the time I put the brightness down on it anyway. So you can put it pretty much all the way down to black, but that's not what I like to do. I always like to have a bit of color still in there. And we can also put it all the way to white. That is another nice look, and I see a lot of great renders where it's really just a white background, which looks like a studio almost then. But I personally like to have some darker tone here, and that is again a personal preference. So now we looked at these skylights here, but let's make everything look even better now. Don't worry right now about the placement of the lights that I have here. we're gonna choose a different skylight in a moment, and then we're gonna set up the lights properly and make this look good. Right now it's just for the fundamentals. And now what we can do here is to go over to our render settings, and let's take a look at this. So also keep in mind that we're looking at it here right now in full quality mode. So if we put that to draft quality, you won't be seeing much of a difference right now. In fact, it almost looks exactly the same, and that's because right now we haven't enabled any of all the good stuff yet. And the most important one is also the one that we have here on top, the ray tracing one, which turns on our global illumination. So take a look here at some of these areas like the cylinder, where right now it looks very flat and we're just missing any sort of depth in there. So if we turn that on, now you see we have it much nicer looking, not only here but anywhere. So this button is the most important that you don't want to forget to turn on, and usually because that makes everything more slow, it makes sense to, you know, have it sometimes just put back to the draft quality mode and we assemble our scene, and then whenever we're ready we can put everything on here. But you know, you can also just leave it on, it depends on your computer. The only thing that it will do is, since it's, how does it say it? It's a path traced system. So that means if we move things around, it takes a moment to actually render it. We have a real-time renderer here. So we want to have ray tracing on, and then let's scroll down here, and I'm gonna have my shadow quality set to high. So it might not really show much of a difference, but let's also, just to make sure that we have all the bells and whistles on, let's put on local reflections and diffuse and our AO. So that takes care here of our render settings, and we're gonna go back once we make videos and actual renders. But now let's focus on our skylight. So one thing to keep in mind is that if we now change this skylight, it will override all the information that we have already put in here. So if you really liked a certain look and you already spent some work putting some lights in there, then the best idea is to right click on the sky here and say duplicate. And now we're automatically being switched here to this copied version, which means that any changes that we do in here now will also reflect on this scene only. And if we re-enable this one here, we're now being put back to that. So that way we can always toggle back and forth between different lights. So just something to keep in mind. So now let's take a look here at our sky library. And you can see we have 190 different skies here to choose from. And we can filter them by skies that we already downloaded by clicking on this button here. So you can see these here are the skies that I already tried, and some of them I like, others maybe they don't give me the kind of look that I'm expecting from whatever scene we're working on. But in general, what we want is to try them out and see whether we like it or not. And you can see here there is this little icon which indicates, if we go over here, that this is something that's still in the cloud. Even has this little cloud icon, so that means I have never tried this sky. And let's say we want to assign this one here. You gotta double click it, and I noticed earlier it takes actually quite a while to download. Maybe my internet connection is crap and I need to reboot my modem, which I usually do when something is slow, but I think it just takes a moment. So whenever this is done, it will then also end up here in this library if I filter for it. And now it's done. So once we double click on it, it will assign it. So now we're looking at LA construction, and it looks quite nice. It has a little bit of a green tint, but that also depends on our rotation here. So if we start to rotate the sky around, we get different looks entirely. So these are all currently without having any further lights added to the scene, and it already looks quite appealing. So what I usually like to do is just rotate it around till I get an interesting angle, and then whenever we're happy, we can start adding our, child lights, but it doesn't have to be a whole lot. So the best approach is usually not to overcomplicate things. That's why you don't want to add like 5 or 6 different lights. That will be a nightmare to control. And in general, I don't do more than 1 or 2 lights, especially in Marmoset Toolbag 4. So once we rotated the camera to something that we like, for example here, it's kind of interesting how the cylinder is illuminated. We can then go ahead and add more child lights, because otherwise it would just be too flat all around. Like it's missing this special something. It's just overall not very interesting. And that's why we can then add a light in here. And now I'm gonna put it over here where we already have light coming from. And that basically now gives it some extra source here. So you see now that if we toggle that on and off, it's just a bit more intense here coming from that direction. And then we could just try to have different sources here with a second light. So this one doesn't seem to do much. So sometimes it's a matter of just trying out where it actually then starts appearing on our render. So maybe I'm just gonna leave it here, 1 or 2 lights. And then what we can also do is bring up the child light brightness a little bit. So we have to be a bit careful with these sliders because they really are reacting strong on anything we do. You can see we increased it from 1 to 2.7, and it might not look like much here on the slider itself, but on the overall picture, we get a dramatic difference in our overall look. So it's usually the best idea to try that in steps and also in combination here with our overall brightness, which will increase everything globally. So trying to find the right middle ground is always the main work here in order to get the proper illumination on our render. So by default, the backdrop brightness is at 1. And if we put it down, we get our dark background back. So once we did a little bit of a setup like we have now, it's time to analyze the picture. Right now, I'm not liking how the shadow is affecting the flashlight here. And simply rotating it a slight bit already results in a completely different look. Well, not really completely, but you can see that now that shadow is gone. And often it's really not more than having to rotate the skylight a little bit to already have a different look than on it. And the reason why I don't want to add too many of these child lights is so that it's actually clear what they do. So this one here is the first one we placed, and sometimes it's just a good idea to move them around a bit here in our scene. Just be careful not to accidentally add a new light that way, but move those lights around and actually see how they are affecting our scene here. So let's put that, for example, here. Now we see this is definitely coming somewhere from the back of the gun, from where we're looking at it now. So maybe let's try to add a third light here. And I like to already put it here where we already have a light source, just to have a more of an impact. and it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to get the right placement. Let's try here on that side. Here we have it. So now this really illuminates everything coming from the front. So you can see how much of an impact that has here. Obviously way too strong. I'm gonna move it further up, and that picks up on some of the blue regions that we have in that HDR image. So it's important never to underestimate the color information that is by default getting picked up on these child lights. So now we have a more overall blue tint here in our scene. And this might actually be a cool thing. You can see if we turn it off, it's more gray. And depending on whether we like it or not, we can decide to keep it or again try different light sources. But you can see how quickly we can change our scene look here. And yeah, I don't want to have more than 3 lights usually. I know I said 1 or 2, but I would say 3 lights is like the maximum that I like to have. I don't want to overcomplicate it. So let's see what that looks like here with a blurred sky. And now if we bring the backdrop brightness up a bit, you can see we get a bit of color in here now. So it's always a matter of taste, trying out different things, and then whenever we're happy, we can go over here to our render setting, and under our output, we can then define the directory where we want the render to be stored, also our sample level, and the same goes if we want to put out a video. And speaking of video, at the moment we don't really have anything interesting set up here to make a video. So in order to do that really fast, what we can do is go over here to our Revolver, basically this layer, and then we want to go over to Scene, Add Object, and add a turntable. So now we have a turntable, but now we also have to enable our timeline here. So now what we can do is plug that here into the bottom. You see it appears this green line, and then if we let go, we have it now properly attached here. So the turntable is a great thing to add because it allows us to rotate our gun here in the viewport without having to move the camera position. So otherwise you would go click here in the viewport and rotate it like that. But that changes the position of our camera, and the better way to do that is to basically just move it here with those sliders to get a look on it from different angles. And then we can also hit that button here and have a 360 animation of it. So we can of course always change our camera position, but sometimes it just makes sense to keep it in place, and we just work with a turntable to rotate it. And of course, it makes also a lot of sense to render these videos out then and add them to your portfolio page, such as for example here ArtStation. And that just makes everything way more interesting over having only static images there. So ArtStation already offers the ability to add these videos, and it's really the perfect thing that we can do here to make our work more interesting looking. Let's take a look at how we export that. So let's say we want to render this here. Then what we have to do is go over to our render settings, and then we can both render the current view as an actual image, which we do here by image, and then all we have to do is hit the render image. And if we want that to be a video, we do that down here. So just keep in mind that it will take quite a while to render that. And if we go over to preferences here, I found that if I put my settings to this here, it's a bit more fast. Before I had it set to accelerated, and I found that for my computer it was taking way longer than having it set like this here. So just a side note, maybe it's because of my system, but I thought I mentioned that. And then the important thing is that we have, of course, our resolution here, 1920 by 1080, that's standard, and that's usually what I like to render with. But the thing is, we need to see whether this actually fits our current frame here. So if we want to render with this resolution, what we have to do is go back to our camera settings, and then we want to enable the save frame. So what that does is that it shows us exactly how the video or the render image will look like. This here is basically our 1920 by 1080 frame scaled down here to that proportion, and that way we know whether it will fit or not. And as you can see here, if we turn the turntable like that, then first of all the revolver is not perfectly centered, and also it's cut off down here. So what we have to do in that case is move it a bit more here to the center first of all, and then we want to move out of this camera position. It doesn't have to be much. But what that makes sure of is that now if we use the slider here, it's perfectly centered and it's not cut off. So that would allow us now to render that out as a video. But before we do that, let's go into our main camera and let's take a look at some of the settings that we haven't enabled yet that will further help to make our render look nice. So far in our camera settings, we only use the field of view slider here to make that more of an orthographic look. And now let's see what else we have in here. So under our lens settings, we have the depth of field. If we enable that, then usually the first thing you see is that it's a blurry mess. And then it's a matter of using this slider here till we get something that looks sort of sharp. And then we have these sliders under it where we control whether it's coming from the front or the back. So it might not be as noticeable here because right now we're looking at the revolver from basically a side perspective. So now we see there's a bit of a blur at the back of the grip, but it becomes more noticeable if we rotate it that way. Now you can see in the background we have it a bit more blurry, and here in the front it's more sharp. So usually I like to put that sometimes on some of the static renders, but not necessarily on the turntable videos. I prefer it if those stay sharp. So let's just disable that for now, and let's take a look here at the flare. So same as with our depth of field, it can be a little bit tricky to make that look right, especially on a turntable animation. So usually I only have that on also for still images. You can see here that once we put the strength up, it starts showing a bit, and then we have further control over it with our threshold and our size. But then here on the turntable, you can see that it can result in very different looks based on whatever frame we're looking at. So basically, since it's really impossible to tell what it looks like for every single frame, it's a little bit hit and miss when it comes to using this in combination with our turntable video. And this is why for now I'm just gonna turn it back down, and then maybe we can always put it up for individual still images. So let's take a look at the distortion, and this is mainly used for the chromatic aberration. So this barrel slider here will bloat everything up in a funny way. But so far I never had a use for it, so unless you like it, I'm gonna turn it back down. And now the chromatic aberration, what that does, if we crank it all the way up, we get this sort of an effect. So basically like the TikTok logo. And I actually quite like this. Of course, not to have it all the way up, but I like to add a bit of this effect to it. I think it gives a little bit of this extra sharpness or interest to the scene. You just gotta be careful because it can then result in some areas looking a little bit like this here, where it's sort of like magenta looking. It's just the way that these colors are overlaid on top of each other. So it's also a matter of, you know, fine-tuning that slider here. Not too much, not too little, but maybe I'm just gonna have it around here. And it's just something that I think makes it a bit more interesting. So let's see what else we got here. Now we have our post effects. And usually what I like to do is add a bit of sharpening. So if we put that all the way up, just to make it clear, it's basically like you go into Photoshop and you sharpen the hell out of it, and you probably don't want to have this. Now it seems it's done loading. It almost looks like a stylized gun now in that light. But since we don't want to have this, I'm just gonna add maybe a little bit here, 0.25 around there. So what we also have here is sliders for contrast, saturation, exposure. I usually never use those, but what I like to do is go into that curve editor, and then we can make this classic S curve here, where we give a bit of saturation here to our low lights and here to our highlights. So basically everything down here are the dark tones, and by having this classic S curve, we give a bit of extra contrast to everything, and I prefer that over putting like some contrast slider up. So I usually put that to all my renders. Just keep in mind that this also makes everything a bit more dark in some areas, and we may have to compensate for that. So let's take a look now at our bloom. And this one is definitely a very nice one to have. Of course, once again, we don't want to exaggerate it, but having this on and at a decent amount here just helps to make it once again more interesting looking and also a bit more expensive. If there is a little bit of this shine, this aura around the things. So again, I don't want to have it too strong, but this here seems like a good level to have it. And we can also fine tune it a bit here by moving that size slider around. So like with everything, it's really often just a matter of trying out these sliders and have a good look at what we're seeing and whether we like it or not. And of course, we also want to look at it here from different angles. So that's always a good idea, not to get too stuck with only this one view, but also rotate the scene around. So now let's take a look at the last one, which is the grain. So this one does as the name suggests, it adds this noisy grain over everything. So in most cases, I don't really like to have that. Maybe you could argue it adds a little bit of interesting contrast to everything, but I think I just put that all the way down. I really don't want to have that overlaid here on top of our actual image. So these would be the camera settings, and those are basically put into place no matter which sky we go to. So if we go back to our old scene, this one here, we still have the same settings applied that we have here under that scene. So this is something important to remember. And same as with the skies, you can duplicate that. And now you can make changes here to that scene. Maybe you want to have a different field of view on it, but it won't show. As you can see, I just changed the field of view. It won't show unless you go over here and go to the copied camera where we just applied these changes to. So now we're looking at the new scene, the one with the perspective, and we can do all sorts of changes to this one while we still have our old camera position with all the settings in place. So whenever you change the camera back here, don't forget to also change it back here because it won't switch automatically. And sometimes I end up making changes and wonder why it doesn't reflect in the viewport. And that way you can easily mess up your existing cameras. So always pay attention to that. And by the way, since we already established our safe frame here and we know this is centered, we can then also get out of it again just to clear up more viewport space here. So I'm actually quite liking what we have here as far as a turntable animation goes. You might find that when you rotate that around here that, well, it's quite a bit in the shadows. But keep in mind that it's only a few frames where it's in the shadows, and the moment it goes here, we have it nicely lit. And this actually results in an overall very interesting look compared to having everything perfectly lit all the time. So it makes it a bit more dramatic. Think of it the same way as watching a movie where it just adds a bit of interest to have like this balance of shadows and light coming. So the same goes for when I make my renders, and as always is a personal taste, but I already went ahead and I rendered this here and it came out really nicely. So we come over here to our render settings, and then we were already looking at it before, but it's as simple as hitting that render video button and it will take care of the complete turntable animation. What I recommend is putting that here to 720 if you just want to test it first, and also bring that sample rate down here. It can even be at 8 or at 16. It just means that it will render it way faster, and that's usually a good idea if you just want to test it. So then once that came out fine, you can always put it back to the higher settings and render it out with more samples and with a higher resolution. Let's also increase a bit here the emissiveness. So if we want to render this here as a turntable, why not crank that up here more? That way it's more visible and it will just make it in general more interesting for our video. And these are the kind of adjustments that we can perfectly do here in Marmoset. And since we're at it, let's go to our lens for the scope, and how about putting that here to a blue? We don't have much color on our Revolver overall. It's very gray tones, so any color is appreciated to break that up a bit. So I'm gonna have it here as this blue. And then if we want, we can also switch the light on here. So we come back here to our emissive at the flashlight, and maybe you just want to render it like that. So you can see we have a lot of ways to make our render interesting and make it a bit unique. And also not to forget that we can switch on and off the attachments that we have here. So maybe we just want to show the Revolver here even without the rail, and then we have some renders without and some renders with it, just to make more of a showcase for it. So now it pays out that we were doing a good job in Blender, giving that all the right names, etc. So when I go back here to that sky, there's actually one cool thing that I noticed when I turn the skylight a bit more into this direction here. You see now we get this nice glow here coming from our image. So I thought this actually looks quite cool also here. So I'm gonna leave it here at this rotation to have this kind of effect on it. And of course we can always come back here to our backdrop. Maybe have that here as a blurred sky for some interesting gradient. But I think I'm gonna stick to the ambient sky. I just don't wanna have it like pitch black. Maybe on the video it looks like it's a complete dark, but it's not. It still has some gradients in there. And I already made a test render and it came out quite well. This here is the 720p version of it. So that was basically just the test, and you can see it came out really nice even though the sampling is all the way down. So then whenever you're ready, you can make a high quality version of that. So let's say you rendered it out, you looked at it, and then you find that, well, you want to change the light after all. Maybe you find that this shot here should have more light coming on it. Then once again, it's really just a matter of changing the light source. And now if you would render it out like that, it would have the light coming here basically more from that side perspective. And the shadows are now pretty much here where before we had it more lit. So this is how we can quickly change things. And this gives us all the flexibility we need to be fast and efficient. So now that we covered quite a bit of this turntable mechanics here, let's say you want to make a nice still render. Well, then it's pretty much the same process as before. You find the right angle and then you decide whether the lighting is the one you like or if it needs more work. And what I like to do is sometimes have it a bit like from this perspective where it's sort of like up looking. I find it just generally makes it a bit more interesting than having this perfectly straight shot, even though I also always include this perspective here. But I always like to put a bit of an angle on it. This goes both for this perspective as well as this one here. And then again, it's a matter of trying out different light sources and whether we're happy with it or not. And also we can make some nice close-ups. So let's zoom in here and then let me find something here. Maybe this again, similar to what we had before. And then we can make a nice close-up shot here. And in that case, maybe you want to go back here to the camera and put our field of view also down a bit. So let's say we have that here with a bit more perspective. This might actually be a good idea here for such a render where you want to kind of have the focus on the barrel. So in such a case, I would actually prefer to have a bit more perspective. So sometimes you might also just want to get inspired by actual pictures, especially if it's as nice as this one. It almost looks a bit like a render, so let's try to replicate it. First, we're gonna get our camera position into place, followed by changing our lighting source. And then if we go over here and select our whole model, we can rotate it like that. And then we want to give it a bit of a tilt here. So once we have that in place, we can go ahead and maybe we want to change our backdrop brightness a bit, because on that picture it looks like it's a bit more bright. We can also try experimenting here with a blurred sky. That way our gradient has a bit more color in it. And then most importantly, let's apply our Revolver metal material to get that nice chromy look. I'm gonna adjust the camera a bit. And now let's take a look here. So as you can see, this already comes quite close. We might have a bit of a different lighting here on our render. Maybe we even prefer it. But if not, we can always further adjust our lights. We can also toggle on and off here our attachments again. And as you can see, we can very quickly come up with different picture compositions here. Let's go into these emissive settings once more, and why not crank that up quite a bit here. Even if it's only for this one render, but if I compare that here with our reference, we got quite a bit of reds going on there coming from this dot. Finding that one camera position is always a bit of just trying it out. I actually think this looks even better. We have more view here on it from the side. And then we can of course also change the position here for our cylinder and the hammer and expose these parts for another alternative render. I'm gonna copy one of these skylights. And I want to go over here to our overcast tab. So as always, it's worth to experiment then also with other scenes here. And I'm going to use this LA one here. And as usual, we have to get the right light source on it. And then we want to increase our brightness, maybe add another light to it. But in that case, it doesn't even seem to be necessary. And this just to once more encourage you to try out different things, different looks. And that way we get really nice renders in record time. So whenever we feel like we have a nice shot here, then we can go back to our render settings. And for still images, I usually don't even make these test renders. I just keep the sample rate all the way up. Have it at 1920 by 1080 usually. We can also turn on or off our transparency. That, by the way, goes also for the videos. It would then render a PNG sequence. Maybe you want to further edit it in After Effects, and a lot of possibilities that way as well. So that's something I always like to do for all the guns, especially the first person ones, to put it in that view that looks like first person. So I wanted to show you something else as well. I'm not gonna go through the full animation, but let's say we have this turntable now and you want to make it a bit more interesting. So for example, what we could do is to spin this cylinder here at the same time while our revolver is also rotating. So what we have to do for that is select the cylinder. And then usually what I like to do is just move it so that we see which one here of our axis gets affected. So now we know it's the Z axis. I'm gonna put it back to 0. And then let's just consider our timeline here, which we already have set to 10 seconds, which is the default length for the turntable. So now what's important to consider is our frames here. And right now we are at the frame 0. So we want to be here wherever we want then to have this animation started. And then the next step is to go over to keyframes. And within our keyframes, you can already see our current selection then active here. So in that case, our cylinder. So now what we have to do is open that up here. I'm gonna expand this a bit here so that we see more what's going on. And then we want to go here to transform. Because here under the Z transform for rotation, we are making sure that this is spinning. So then let's go here. And by selecting transform, it will basically keyframe everything. All that we want here is the rotation for Z. So what we have to do here is adding a keyframe at the current frame, which is at 0. And then we go over here to the very last frame. And now what we want to do here is put that up to, for example, 360. So that way we tell it that it's supposed to spin 360 from the first frame to the last, and then we're gonna keyframe it here. So let's hit that again, and that will give us our animation. Let's go back to the timeline. Let's play the animation, and you will see that not only is it spinning, but it's also easing out at the end and easing in at the beginning. So maybe that's not even what we want. Like, let's say we want to have a continuous animation. So for that, we have to go back here to the keyframe tab and notice how we have this curve here on it. That means it has an easing on it. So it will sort of like start slowly at the beginning and then end slowly at the end and have its momentum in the center. So what we want to do, if we want it to be continuous, we select both keyframes and put it here to this straight edge mode. So that way we tell Marmoset, look, we want 100% linear animation, and if we play it, you see that it's completely continuous. We don't have anything that is ever different. It's just playing smoothly 360 all the way around. And if you would render that out, it would loop perfectly. So if you want it to be twice as fast, you have to put in 720 at the last frame instead of 360, and that way it will spin twice as fast. So this is how we can animate something like that, and that goes for every object. So that would be a very basic animation to have the cylinder spinning, and one idea that I had here was to make it look like that. So we have these attachments coming down and basically flying onto the revolver and attaching to it. Even the bullets are come flying in. Now we have the hammer pull back, same time as the trigger. And there is like some effects that I was editing with the video editing software. And now it's blending over here to the other texture that we did, the Chrome version. So I made that here for the trailer video because I wanted to show how customizable the Revolver is. That we have these different attachments that we're also working on. And one thing that you might wonder if you try to replicate that is, how did I do this? Wait, let me pause it at the right moment. How did I get this motion blur there? So you see it's a little bit blurry the moment it flies in, and that gives this nice effect of having some speed momentum. So from what I heard, Marmoset is going to have this motion effect as a feature built into it. But right now we have to rely on After Effects to do this kind of a motion blur. So simply export out the turntable with the animations that we created, bring it into After Effects and follow the steps of this excellent small tutorial here. Add motion blur in Adobe After Effects by how to shoot and edit. And then after you processed it and followed these steps here, you'll get the exact kind of motion blur look as you've seen it here on my video, where the moving parts have this nice motion blur effect added to it. So right now we have to rely on After Effects, but in the future we might get that as an extra feature in Marmoset as well. So another thing that I wanted to show you is how to make an interesting looking scene real fast in Blender. So what I did here was that I took these two revolvers so that we can have both the metallic version as well as the painted steel version. And I basically placed it on the ground here and positioned a few of these bullets as well as our attachments to make it a bit more interesting. And then I added a plane right under them. So with that in place, what we can do is just basically select everything, and then we're gonna simply export that as a FBX. And once we come back to Marmoset, we pretty much have a simple scene put together real fast. And all I did here was that I added an additional normal map here that tiles over this plane. So this is just optional. I'm not even sure whether I want to keep that or not. If we don't have it, we can also just use this plane here with a standard material on it and get some nice roughness effects on it, where basically it's acting like a mirror. And then we can find different angles on it and already have like an interesting composition just with that shot. And of course, as always, it's a matter of trying out different lights, playing around with the materials. You know, maybe we don't like how the lens looks there, a bit too opaque. So a lot of small little fine tuning, as always, necessary to get that kind of a scene that we really like. Usually for me, I just like to keep it simple, so most of the time I don't even bother with such a scene. But in a case here like our Revolver, where we have these bullets and then we have our attachments as well as two different texture versions, it's a good idea to make such a beauty render where we have the whole composition in front of us. And then it's also easier, once we look here through our camera, to move these individual pieces, where before in Blender I was simply already sort of positioning them loosely. But since we have all our pivots in place here, we can then do the final composition here while we are in Marmoset. So here this background canvas is really only a plane. And it's amazing what we can do with a simple normal map on it. There is no other texture. It's simply that material here plus a normal map. Some people even like to model something for it, like these background canvas that maybe it has some height information and consists out of different materials. But in general, I like to keep the focus on the objects that we did and keeping it simple for it. So I'm gonna make a quick cut because I wanted to show you the final composition that I made. I chose the courtyard brick building vines here, and then I was adding two lights to it. So you can see that one of them I actually put a bit of a red into the light. So I was individually adding it to it. And that way it might not even be very visible, but you can see a bit of this red aura here. And I just think that makes it look a bit more interesting. So as you can see, I changed the normal map. I didn't like the hexagon pattern after all, because I find it's a bit too distracting. So what I did instead was I went to Google Images and I just searched for plaster normal map. And then you can just try out different maps and see what you like. And if you put it in as a detail normal map, you can also change the weighting. Like for example, if I put that up here, you see it becomes more strong now. And that way we can also get different results in very fast time. The one that I ended up using looks like that here. I like that it has a little bit of this organic appearance here, this plaster, while not being too distracting. And what I also did was to separate out this part here so that we get to see the details that we have here at the inside, which is otherwise hidden here. And also I put it over here so it's a bit blurred, which means that in our camera settings, I was putting the depth of field up a bit so that here at the background, it's becoming a bit more faded out that way. And then I also have quite a bit of the chromatic aberration on it. So I put that up a bit and it becomes more visible once you render it and then you zoom in, especially here at the back. You can see that effect here and it just is a really nice sharpening effect in almost a way. So I think that came out really well, this composition. I look forward to see what you come up with. And that means we are at the end of the Revolver tutorial. Congratulations again for anyone that followed it all the way through. The Revolver tutorial is aimed at anyone that wants to learn 3D modeling as well as texturing for video games. I'm gonna leave you with a 2-minute long trailer for it in case you haven't had the chance to watch it yet. I'll be seeing you next time. Happy modeling and cheers! Hey everyone, Tim from Chamferzone here. Welcome to the chapter overview for an all-new weapon tutorial. This time we're going to create a customizable revolver as well as 2 attachments for it, a flashlight and reflex scope. For that we will be working in Marmoset Toolbag, in Substance Painter, as well as in Blender, where we're going to spend quite a bit of time as we're working on our models. Whenever we're done with the initial modeling stages, we will then make use of Blender's house-own remeasure capabilities, which is a modifier-based and non-destructive way to create high-poly models in record time and with stunning results. Personally, I'm gonna be using this workflow for all my future work now, and I'm excited to share it with you. After we're done unwrapping our models, we will also make sure that everything is perfectly pivoted as well as named and attached to make it as game ready as it can be. Once we're done with Blender, we will then export our high and low poly files over to Marmoset, where we're gonna be doing baking, and then import these maps over to Substance Painter, where we create 2 different texture versions. A chrome version as well as a metallic paint-coated version. As we do that, we're gonna make use of different smart masks, materials, as well as carefully studying different types of wear and tear, which ultimately comes down to personal preference and choice. Whenever we're done with our textures, we will then revisit Marmoset Toolbag, where we're gonna make renders as close to photorealism as possible, while making use of Marmoset's ray tracing engine. I had a lot of fun working on this tutorial. I hope you're also gonna enjoy it. Happy modeling and cheers!